Hi everyone, and welcome to the TuringTest podcast by Siili. TuringTest is a journey into the transformative power of artificial intelligence, specifically tailored for software developers and software business leaders. My name is Juha-Matti Tirilä. I am a senior data scientist at Siili, and I personally and Siili seek to double our productivity with the use of AI systems. In today's episode, we will meet Irene Solaiman, the head of global policy at Hugging Face. Hugging Face is the leading global platform where the machine learning community collaborates on models, datasets, and applications. So welcome. Very nice to have you here, Irene.
Thanks so much for having me.
How's your day going?
It's, just another day in AI. I've got a very big agenda, but excited for this talk.
Irene, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and also your role at Hugging Face?
Sure. I came into the AI world in a thoroughly nonlinear path, which seems quite commonplace in the AI world. So at Hugging Face, kind of think GitHub of AI. It's the leading platform for not just models, but all sorts of AI artifacts like data sets and what we call spaces, which are kind of like demos. I built our policy from the ground up. And I didn't actually come in as a policy person. I came in as a researcher. That gets a little bit into my background. I have a background academically in policy and international relations, but decided to learn to code to show how I can have clear returns on doing a kind of machine learning work for human rights. I worked at OpenAI when it was a very different company. It was 100 people. It's funny to look back on it now. And that's where I started working with early GPT systems and found it was so important to understand the technical side in order to enact meaningful policy. That's part of what I'm doing today, is melding the research and the engineering with policy.
I guess you touched upon it already a little bit, but for people who don't know Hugging Face, can you summarize it briefly, like what it is?
Yes, it's a community-oriented company and platform. And if you're familiar with GitHub, this kind of repository that hosts right now over 1 million models, hundreds of thousands of data sets. It's the leading infrastructure for being able to build with AI.
Also, this maybe you touched a little bit already, but what exactly inspired you to focus on the AI ethics and policy in your career?
Well, I originally thought when I was coming out of college, going into the workforce, that I was going to do human rights oriented government work. And turns out reading a lot of human rights violations was not good for my mental health. And not that Silicon Valley is known for shining mental health, but I found that being able to code, being able to work from a different angle, I could enhance people's rights. I could maybe empower people's rights through technology, and also examine systems and make sure that those are rights abiding.
And for sure, as you said, like a nonlinear path to AI and all these systems. So, based on your experiences with OpenAI, what's your take on artificial general intelligence that they're sort of like trying to approach, and maybe also other companies' approaches to AGI?
Yeah, it's so interesting to see AGI become mainstream. I was working on, of course, when you're at OpenAI, you work on AGI, and it was not something that I even heard outside of Silicon Valley particularly. So I think it's, I don't have visibility into what OpenAI is doing now. It's an enormous company. It's so interesting to see companies that focus on AGI be so frankly large, that it takes a lot of international viewpoints when you're trying to make something that is so generalizable. We see now Meta and Anthropic and Google leaning toward this, and these are institutions with a lot of footprint around the world. So I think I'm really glad to see more international engagement. And I'm also bullish about the kinds of work, of course, from Hugging Face, as well as some other companies like Cohere that are investing in multilinguality that maybe aren't as large as an OpenAI or a Google, but are taking this different angle that is so meaningful to different parts of the world.
So regarding AGI, I guess there are some aspects about deploying that and developing it in a safe way. So what are your thoughts on that?
Part of the issue is that there's no consensus on what the definition for AGI is. There's different viewpoints throughout the AI field on what it means to reach AGI. Is there an evaluation, a benchmark? And then there's different viewpoints on what safety means. That's actually a very feisty and often rife with disagreement discussion. Ultimately, safer, powerful AI is best determined by the user, but we recognize that not all users are equal, not all governments are equal, and not everybody has everybody's best interest at their own heart. So it's going to be an iterative process as systems continue to get more powerful.
Let's talk a little bit about the importance of AI ethics. But first of all, I guess everybody knows at least approximately what AI is and what ethics is. But what do those mean together exactly?
That was exactly what I was going to dig into, because it's very difficult for one word or a couple words to encapsulate so many different meanings, especially as they're applied. When we talk about AI, especially in my field, it's come to be what type of system are you speaking about? Often where I work is around generative systems. However, there's so many types of AI systems. There's so many narrow systems. Even on Hugging Face, there are hundreds of thousands of more narrow tailored systems that are being used at a smaller scale, but really meaningfully. For example, in the biospace, I very briefly worked at the North American real estate company called Zillow that trained on decades of real estate transactions and then would predict a housing valuation. That was such an important space for AI and is deeply impactful on people's lives. So I want to be conscious of this huge field. In ethics, particularly, I don't consider myself an ethicist. Often ethics is framed in an academic setting, or it has a lot of more historical meaning behind it, as opposed to the type of policy work that I lead. The way that I've seen it applied throughout different academic conferences also differs by type of narrow system, how that system is applied, for example, with these types of real estate or mortgage predictions. In the case of generative AI systems, a system that is not developed for any specific application has many different worldviews of what could be possibly ethical, especially without that context.
So this is like ethics of AI. So why do you think this is important? So what makes it so important?
When we're building systems, often from a technical standpoint, they're being built for a specific function. So for a language model, for instance, a language model is meant to predict the next token given a set of tokens. It's not inherently, just by that definition, embedding any sort of safety metrics. This is something that society and industry and academia is investing in, because once we build that system, how it's deployed greatly impacts people. And often, if we're building a system for people, we want it to be value aligned. We want it to be safe. We want to not harm. I think it's so important for safety by design to be integrated from even project conception. And this includes ethical considerations from, are we generating harmful content? To whom is this content harmful? How will that differ by type of system? When I see a language output that has disturbing language, I might react differently to that versus an extremely violent graphic generated image. And what does that mean in a cultural context?
Agree 100%. So now I think you talked already a little bit about like generative AI versus like traditional AI. I guess you used the phrase narrow AI. Am I understanding correctly? So what differences are there with respect to ethics in Gen AI and then this narrow AI?
So based off of my work, having done ethical evaluations, particularly around fairness on specifically these narrow systems and on language models, it's often more abstract to evaluate generative systems, particularly outside of their context. You don't have a frame of reference for which to determine, let's use fairness as an aspect of something that we should consider within ethics. You don't have a frame of reference for what is fully fair for a language model, as opposed to when you're doing something like evaluating a housing predictive model, you're looking at, okay, it's deployed to look at how much is this house worth in this given neighborhood? What does this mean for, and then you look at the metric for a protected class. So often when we're looking at fairness, we're looking at these classes like gender and race, religion, these types of protected classes. Is this fair for a Black family versus a white family? And that helps you kind of structure the evaluation. When you're looking at a language model, there's basically infinite different axes by which you can analyze this model. You can say, are any outputs along even one protected class, race, is that fair for professions, for where they live? The lack of context makes it so much more complex. That changes when that system is deployed in a specific context.
Yeah, I guess like one way to characterize those narrow systems is that there's sort of a ground truth where we can like compare the output of the system to the ground truth and see whether that was like correct or how close it was to the actual answer or not. So yeah, totally agree that in these language models, the ground truth doesn't exist, that the reference answer doesn't maybe exist. And so it's a little bit difficult to formulate those kinds of ethical questions.
Well, it depends on the area where ground truth will evolve with time. What we see as societal norms is also very different from what we saw as acceptable 20 years ago. And then there's also ground truth when we're thinking about reflecting. So there's systems that do predictive recidivism in the US, unfortunately. This is the likelihood that a criminal offender is likely to repeat that criminal offense. And those systems are based off of often really flawed aspects of our criminal justice system that could be exacerbating these harms, even if they are ground truth.
Yeah. And then we talked about language models, but then there's also like image generation and all of that.
Yeah.
I was trying to produce some images of a soccer group lately, and all I got was like middle-aged white guys and with really like athletic bodies. And I tried to tell the system like, no, that's not what I want. I want some diversity, and we don't look like that. And there's all of that too.
Exactly.
With the multimodality and not just language models.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about being ethical when creating these systems and crafting the solutions, who exactly needs to be ethical? I mean, there's like OpenAI and there's Google and there's Facebook and all these companies. They're producing maybe the base models and the capabilities. And then there's companies like maybe Siili and others who are making use of those systems through APIs and all kinds of methods. I guess the approach is totally different, and the aspects of being ethical are a little bit different. So can you maybe expand on that a little bit?
There's so many actors and stakeholders in the AI world, and there's those who are more visible, and there are those who also have the resources to build super powerful systems. Not all systems need to be compute intensive, powerful, large to be usable, to be good. I'm really bullish about smaller systems. There's a ton of work happening in the open source community, in the academic community, and there's often different actors who are plugging in at different layers of development. So when you're asking who should be ethical, it's really everybody, including the users. And this is to be conscious of not putting too much burden on the users, but people generate really weird things and then they distribute it. So there's that endpoint, but up to development, there's also not enough attention being given to the dataset collation and curation. There's the popular approach of scraping the internet, but there's also more tailored approaches that organizations take with crafting data sets and even more specific data sets based off of the task. There are more medical data sets that need to be really conscious of local laws around medical data that will often differ by jurisdiction and often be more strict than general personal identifiable information. There's going to be specific ways that we look at multimodal data sets versus text data sets. And there needs to be a lot of attention from the data set side to how we're training to like I was saying, safety by design. really ensuring that ethical and safety considerations are threaded throughout the development process, and recognizing that it's maybe not always one institution. It's not just a Google or an OpenAI who are going to be touching every single part of development throughout.
Could you expand a little bit on how the user, the end user, might be ethical or not when using these systems?
The internet is full of a diverse audience, to put it lightly. Not everybody wants to generate things that are helpful for people. And often users can generate harmful images, whether it's malicious or not. That's also distinctions between disinformation and misinformation. Sometimes there is malicious intent, and sometimes people generate silly things and it kind of takes off. On the user side, something that I'm very concerned about is non-consensual content. That is unfortunately something that we have to think about in the AI world. And it is often people who are adapting models or who are putting non-consensual content models on the App Store. The approach for accountability that South Korea and Taiwan have taken legally is to ensure that users who are generating this type of harmful content face consequences for distribution and intent to harm. So for example, and this is disturbing, so thanks for engaging with it, but really important, if a user generates CSAM and distributes that user should be liable because they are the person with that intent to commit that extreme harm.
So maybe we can now focus on the business world a little bit and think about cases where ethical oversights when working with AI systems or crafting AI systems led to problems. What lessons can we learn from that? Can you maybe give some like general examples of those kinds of things happening and what we learned from them?
There's a case of false positives, and there's some complaints now with more popular models that if you put more safety metrics and safety filters, you might have difficulty getting all the answers that you want. It's always a hard trade-off, and the evaluations are difficult. So when we're asking about a war and you want to get information from a language model on either side of the war, there's a danger of spreading disinformation. There's a danger of radicalization. So it's a hard product question. Should you prevent any sort of information on this topic? And if you're doing so, that could limit the amount of generations that model is even capable of doing. So if you have a country example, if you flag that country every time, it's going to be hard to work with that model. So there's a way to over-index on it that it has frustrated some users, but can often make sense from a product standpoint.
Yeah, so I see you do a lot of research regarding AI policies and ethics. So in addition to the artificial intelligence world and the software world changing pretty rapidly, what kinds of changes are taking place on the research front? I mean, on the sort of the next level, what's changing? What's different than what it was like 10 years ago?
Immensely different. I couldn't conceptualize the research world that we're in today. What's partly top of mind is this week, Apple had a big event showcasing AI work, and it's often the business presentations aren't going to get into all of the research background. But actually, Apple had been working on open source language models that they shared on Hugging Face that were part of what was not explicitly said, but part of their presentation this week. I think it's so interesting to see research meld to constraints and interest of this world. So one of those being smaller localized models. We often hear about the intense cost in many ways, not just money, but also carbon of building and running extremely powerful models. But we're seeing Apple and Microsoft build these tiny, highly capable models. Mistral from France also created a model that's not locally runnable, but reaches pretty good performance with far fewer parameters. That's something that I'm really interested in. And generally in the research world, I see a lot more focus on safety evaluations, which I'm glad to see. And part of this is shaped by the increasing policy conversation.
Yeah. So now we talked about like biases, and now you mentioned like environmental sustainability and all this like creating malicious content, all of that. Is there something that we're missing now in these conversations about AI ethics? Is there a point we should
There's
mention?
an infinite list.
Right.
And what people prioritize is often going to differ by lab, by country. The reason part of why I share these specific topics is that it's an association bias. It doesn't mean they're necessarily more important, but there's often more literature in those areas. There's more work done.
I've seen you talk about regulations in the EU and the European Union and the US. So what are your thoughts about the differences of regulation on these continents? So how's the landscape looking on both of these?
The EU has been working on regulating AI for a long time. And I think part of what's important in the EU approach is putting different aspects of AI considerations in different laws. So I don't think GDPR, not that I wrote it or had any input on it, but it wasn't written with generative AI systems in mind. And as all laws are, it's imperfect, but it does address some aspects of privacy that the EU AI Act does not. These are the kinds of layers of legislation that can address different aspects of AI. The US is taking a notably more innovation forward approach. And right now we're having, frankly, concerns that since the federal government is a little bit slower than states, there might be patchwork, different approaches by US state. This is happening in privacy. Many different US states, notably led by California, the California Consumer Protection Act, have different privacy legislation, and there does not exist a US privacy framework. There are movements. I've been working more closely with the US side. That's Hugging Face is a US company. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm very American. With the US Congress on what proposed legislation should look like, and also what that looks like for more international engagement. I see the US has more formal engagements than the EU does, and that is exemplified by the US and UK having a formal AI Safety Institute collaboration. Both the US and UK have taken this innovation approach. The EU has stated that they wanted to lead on trustworthy AI. I think there's ways that they need to overlap as many companies, including ours, just deploy around the world. But there's a culturally different approach.
Let's move on to AI and ethical development. And what I mean here is like using AI to assist systems development, software development, and systems development in general. So our ambitious goal is to double productivity using Gen AI-based coding assistance. So how realistic do you find that?
Well, it depends on what coding means. This is the difficulty with words and the types of system that you're using and the intended output. Coding generally and everything from web development seems like generative systems can do quite a good job there. However, for example, for being able to program new language models, maybe not quite so much.
Well, we'll see. We'll try that.
Yeah.
Happens.
So this is what do you mean by productivity and coding assistants? I think it's important that they be framed as assistants, as a tool. And when we're talking about coding, there's just so many different tasks that I find I used to use Copilot a lot, and unfortunately I don't code as much as I would like to these days. But there's a necessary training, there's a necessary comfort with being that person using a sort of assistant. The type of puzzle solving, the type of more complex coding, sometimes, especially among my friends, the assistants may not be as helpful for these types of more novel areas.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, it's a different thing to produce something that is like basically copy and paste type of content that the assistants are really capable of like producing lots of, in contrast to something that needs like creativity and a lot of thinking and maybe understanding the systems profoundly. So those differ. It really depends. Still thinking about this, like how to be productive using these systems. What sorts of steps would you take? What kinds of actions do you find useful when trying to deploy the system so that they are useful from a systems development point of view?
Thinking about the systems as a tool for personal productivity, it's up to the user and the user's comfort. I think sorts of training programs should not just be centered around how to use the tool, but how to use that tool meaningfully. There are so many training programs and, how to use Gen AI and how to program in Python. What's so much harder is how to do checks to ensure that you're not generating malicious code, that what you're developing is, if you're doing web development, for example, that it's accessible to many different peoples, that it's accessible to colorblind peoples. There's these aspects that should be part of training. And it's also a question of how you measure productivity. Oftentimes, productivity from an economic standpoint is measured in output over time, as opposed to whatever metric we have for the strength of the output. So it goes back to, is it a significant boost in how people are finding the tool that they're using and how the deliverable is being presented?
Yeah, I think this industry is still finding ways to use these tools. I think, for example, a colleague of mine was doing this data transformation. He had some structured data in one format and wanted it in another one. And ChatGPT did that just fine, no problem.
Yeah.
But then there are cases where it's just not like, sometimes we would like to ask questions like, I have this code repository and some weird choices have obviously been made in the process of developing this system. I don't understand them. Could you explain what has happened like historically in this project? And maybe sometimes, I don't know if it sometimes works, maybe probably quite often it doesn't, or these tools wouldn't be able to find the answers to those kinds of questions. Returning a little bit into the ethics, when developers try to deploy these systems and try to exploit them in a way that's useful for them, do you think there are some specific ethical considerations that they need to consider?
So when integrating code assistance, there's some really interesting analysis from when Codex was first being developed, led by Dr. Heidi Kloff, looking at hazard analysis for coding assistance. Some of the tests that I used to do were building classifiers, for example. So this goes back to what are the types of tasks that you're looking for. When I was building classifiers for racial classification around text, there were some problematic words that were popping up. And this is not obvious for even coding assistants that are more narrow than language models, are still not necessarily developed for any specific coding task. When you're thinking about classifiers, bringing up slur words can be a problem. Making sure that they function well across all different languages. Most programming languages default to American English as the primary language. But if you're looking for certain keywords or variables, that might be better to have stronger performance in local languages. And then the types of tests that you need to do for coding assistance should be cognizant of potential malicious code that might not be obvious to the programmer, but could have harmful effects with the output.
Yeah, and I guess there's, at least early on, there was a lot of concern regarding the possibility of accidentally copying someone else's copyrighted content. I mean, code that being generated with these coding assistants. But I guess there hasn't really been that much talk about this lately. Have you encountered that?
So that's interesting by type of modality. So for code, I hear a lot less about data memorization than I do for image. And this is often informed by the existing law and how that differs by training data. There's just different law for human generated images, so art, versus human generated code, and whether that's protected by copyright and what that looks like by different jurisdictions. I don't hear a lot on the code generative side as much as where this is just where the attention is and what this looks like for where that code is coming from. This comes back to training data. is a lot of the training data coming from repositories that have terms of use, and are the terms of use permitting the training of that data? There's additional concerns of not fully understanding what training data is being outputted. And this goes back to data memorization. There's really interesting research on how you can prompt models to give you that exact IP, whether that is reliable and whether that differs for example, code, if that's considered speech, if that's considered protected speech or human IP, and what that looks like for example, images or audio would often differ by law.
So now let's move on a little bit from this AI-assisted coding, just AI systems in general now. Can you mention an example of a successful AI implementation where ethical considerations played a critical role? I mean, that would have been a complete failure without clear and proper attention to the ethical side.
It goes back to ethical to whom, and everything's going to be a sort of not necessarily disaster, but as much as you want to be cognizant of different peoples, there might not be some aspect that pleases some audience. So a successful AI implementation recently, two big ones that I'm excited about is lowering the cost for non-English language generations. And we see this from both Cohere's Command R and from OpenAI's GPT-4o. They have different language sets, but it's historically quite expensive to generate tokens for especially non-Latin character languages. This just increases accessibility. That lowering the cost just increases accessibility to so much of the world. And it's difficult to consider what is ethical. I think this is also business standpoint. When you're opening a product to work better for millions of people in their most comfortable language, that's a huge business gain. It's better for that population. It's just a better product.
I think that's a brilliant example. Yeah, that's really interesting. You've done a lot of talking, and you've been on many podcasts and written a remarkable amount of research. What would you point our listeners and viewers to, like some other resources where to find out about ethics in AI and related topics, maybe the policies and what else is important in this regard?
It is absolutely impossible to keep up with everything. It's more sustainable to look at certain areas of interest and look at certain, not just if you're interested in specific systems, if you're interested in specific modalities, and if you're interested in specific functional areas. A lot of my research recently is looking at generative AI systems particularly, but on how they're released. So that's part of what I've been writing. If you're interested in policy, there's some really good newsletters. I generally go to academic research centers for more of a neutral and technically informed analysis of the landscape. Stanford's Human-Centered AI Research Lab, Stanford's High, has an excellent newsletter, and they also have events and publicly available events online. The Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology takes more of a national security approach to policy and has a very helpful newsletter that looks at the policy landscape. Generally, these types of research centers I found very helpful, and there are good. I mean, for overall podcasts, I can't listen to every single one of them. I read a lot of technical papers. I get outputs of conferences. I generally highly recommend looking more at the academic world.
Yeah, and maybe also irenesolaiman.com. I think it was .com, right? So maybe people should head out over there.
That's very kind. So that's a lot of my media engagements. Appreciate that.
A final question, again, a little bit on the AI-assisted coding and systems development perspective. When do you think Gen AI will be a better developer than us humans?
I find this human benchmark question so interesting because it's a question of which human, and being the average human sounds like kind of an insult. I think a lot of generative systems already are better than the average human who maybe doesn't have Python familiarity. But on specific tasks, I mean, generative systems are better than I am at web development. I've never claimed to be a web development expert. I haven't built a website in 10 years. Easily surpasses me today. I think generative systems are going to be better at humans at some tasks, are maybe not going to surpass an expert. There are better benchmarks needed for determining what that human capability is. And our needs as a society and what needs to be developed are going to change. Who knows what types of systems we're going to be developing 10 years from now. Even I couldn't have imagined where we are right now from last year. I think it's going to be better at us in some more simple tasks, but I never say never. There's so many incredible people working on incredibly powerful systems that for sure are better than I am at coding, at least.
Thank you for your insights, Irene. This was a really, really nice talk with you.
Great. Thanks so much.
In today's episode, Irene Solaiman, the head of global policy at Hugging Face, gave us a lot of valuable information regarding ethics in systems development. I personally found that very useful. So thank you, Irene, and on to the next episodes of the show. Thank you also, our listeners.